Come on up, the knowledgeable ones. We have a real treat tonight. I believe that we have Mark Eakin by Skype. He's the Yeah, oh, there you are. Hey, I'm so glad you could join us. Hey, yay! I don't know if you can see anybody, but we have a whole audience here that are just totally moved by this film and by all the work that's being done. So I think what I would like to do is, first of all, introduce you, of course. Mark Eakin, he's the NOAA coral reef expert. Watch. And we also have with us Dr. Roger Payne. Roger, man, you are known by everybody. Roger is not only a very dear friend of ours, but he is the only scientist in the world that has studied every ocean to find out how it's changing. And he's the only person in the world that discovered the songs of the whales. I'm honored to have you on stage and to be with you. Many more years to come, I hope. Brian McInerney. I just met you. I was actually introduced by someone that we both know by saying that you really are, you're a hydrologist, but you are actually with the National Weather Service. You're the person that they call and they want to find out what's happening, right? Yeah. So you're the expert, right?
Yeah, in addition to being a hydrologist, I'm also the climate change person for the National Weather Service in Salt Lake City Forecast Office.
Perfect. And then my gem on my left is Dr. Brian Moench. I met Brian at a party for the water keepers, and I was so impressed with him about how he knows how global warming has affected the human body. He is brilliant about what's happening with the air that we breathe and the environment and how it affects our bodies. And he's a real truth sayer. He has a lot of people that totally admire him and then people that just say it just can't be true. And I know the difference, and I'm really honored to have you here with us tonight. So Mark, I'm so glad that you're with us. Thanks for being able to make this happen. Maybe we should start with Q&A with the audience. We do have mics on the aisles. And I cannot see from where I'm standing, so if somebody just line up and we'll start with questions for Mark. And go ahead. I don't know. Are the mics on, Scott?
I don't know if you can hear me if the mic is on, so we'll wait for it to. Well, I mean, I'm thinking the guy on the screen may not be able to hear it, so you can repeat it, I guess.
I'll repeat it, but is your mic turned on?
Is there a switch to turn on? I think it's one of those where they turn it on over there.
There we go.
Okay, cool. Hello. So I actually don't. I guess I'm curious, as the ever optimist. Has anybody tried, to any of your knowledge, to genetically modify coral in a way that would make a warmer ocean or oceans changing as they are in composition less of an issue in order to work on the larger ecosystem? And if not, why not?
Actually, that's a really good question, and that's something that some folks are addressing. In fact, you saw one of them in the film. Ruth Gates at the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology has been working with Madeline Van Oppen at the Australian Institute of Marine Science. And under a funding from the Paul G. Allen Foundation, they have been doing work to try and breed supercorals. There are really two pieces to this. One is trying to find a way to make the corals themselves tolerate higher temperatures. Another is to find ways to make the algae that are inside of them tolerate higher temperatures. And what they've been doing is going through and finding those corals that are most able to survive high temperatures, crossbreeding them with others, training them by putting them in situations where they're tortured by high temperatures and high CO2 that we expect in the future, and then crossing those and seeing if they can breed a better coral. We don't have any efforts right now doing it from a genetically modified organism sort of approach, the actual insertion of genes, because not enough is known about the genetics of either the coral or the algae to be able to know what to insert where if you wanted to do that. But they are going through this process of trying to breed some supercorals. The real challenge is, what are the physiological limitations to that? And we've been seeing severe bleaching going on this year in the Red Sea, and we've seen it in some past years. And these are some of the warmest places on Earth. And so we know that even there are some limits. And so trying to figure out just what those limits are and how quickly we can get them to be ready for a warmer future is one of the efforts underway.
Thank you.
Hannah?
I just have a question on, I know we saw the last of basically the Great Barrier Reef where Zach and Charlie were diving, but is there an estimate of how much or how many reefs around the world are still alive versus the amount of them that are dead?
We're working on that right now, in fact. What we know is that an area of about 70 to 75% of the world's reefs were affected by severe coral bleaching during this 3-year bleaching event that just ended. See, this is what's been unusual. You saw a piece of it in the film, and they were talking about what was going on the Great Barrier Reef in 2016. There was an event that started in June of 2014 and extended through May of 2017. It was, rather than a global event that happened within 1 year, it's happened over a 3-year period, which is absolutely horrible. And many of the reefs were hit in back-to-back years, which is even worse because they don't have a chance to recover. So the ones that survive are hit again. But what we've seen is that about 70% of the world's reefs were hit by this bleaching event. Over 30 to 35% were influenced by the temperatures that can cause severe bleaching and the sort of mortality like you saw in the Great Barrier Reef. You saw the figure from 2016 that 29% of the Great Barrier Reef was lost. In fact, 22% more of the corals of the Great Barrier Reef were lost in 2017. And so the combination of those 2 years, that number isn't out yet. They're still finalizing that work, but we're looking at somewhere around half of the corals on the Great Barrier Reef lost over that 2-year period. So this has been a horrendous event that has been affecting corals all around the world and gives us a bit of a taste of what to expect in the future as continuing warming climate leads to back-to-back years of coral bleaching.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious. Obviously, the rising sea temperatures are having an enormous impact on the corals, as your film points out. But I used to dive off of Santa Barbara, and I also lived in Hawaii for several years. This is about almost 20 years ago. And I noticed that an increasing number of dive boats with inexperienced divers going and kicking the corals and knocking the corals, leaving trash in the in the oceans on these diving amateur dive boat expeditions. And I'm wondering, to what degree does direct human impact also have an effect on the health of the coral reefs?
Oh, absolutely. Direct human impact has a real detrimental reduction in coral cover on local basis, whether it's from divers kicking things, whether it's from pollution from land, especially nutrients and sediment runoff, whether it's the problems of overfishing or destructive fishing, or just straight up construction work, putting in seawalls, doing shoreline construction, putting in new piers. All of these things are direct insults that are having an effect on corals all around the world. And added up, they do have a major impact. The problem that we're running into with the climate situation is even the most remote areas where there's nobody there, islands no one is living on, some of our most protected areas, marine protected areas like in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument, where almost nobody goes, and it's very difficult to get a permit to go out there. Those places were being hit severely by the warm temperatures. So we really have to be looking at both of these. And this gets to the crux of conservation. It's a both-and situation. we need to be addressing the climate change that's causing this widespread loss of corals around the world. But we also have to be addressing those local factors that are causing corals to undergo declines on a local basis.
Hello. Can you see me? Hi. No?
Yes.
Tell us your name and company.
Yeah. So my name is Shane Fox. My company. I'm CEO of Linked 3D. If you ever want to 3D print something, visit us. I actually don't have a question. I just I wanted to thank you. You know, your work and your team's work is absolutely fascinating. And you know, I've seen a lot of documentaries that, you know, have moved me, and I sat in the back and I actually cried. You know, the best memories that I've shared in my life have been on dives with my dad and my friends, and I don't touch the coral. But you know, it's you know, my team. I'm going to mobilize my team to help in whatever way we can, whether it's, you know, financial contribution or whatever we can do. But I was just so moved, and I can't imagine, you know, the bureaucracy and the things that you must go through. So it's just phenomenal, and thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And in fact, the bureaucracy is the reason I'm not able to be there with you, unfortunately.
You brought up a very good point. I did want to ask you, Mark, what is if people wanted to contribute to helping the coral reef, what can they do?
There are a number of different options. One of them, you saw that there's an effort called 50 Reefs that has been put together. And Richard Vevers, through the Ocean Agency, they have launched this effort called 50 Reefs, which is looking to find those reefs around the world that are most likely to survive as the temperatures warm, the places that are most likely to either see less warming or be affected less by the warming that goes on, and that can then serve as seed banks for the surrounding reefs to be able to repopulate coral reefs in the area. So 50 Reefs is an excellent option, and they are looking to find new sources of funding, and this is tapped into places that are different from the usual places for conservation funding. And we have the Bloomberg Foundation, the Paul G. Allen Foundation, and Tiffany and Company foundations involved in that, but definitely looking for more and greater involvement, and that's an area that can definitely use some help.
I want to thank you for a wonderful film that balances advocacy and hard science and the necessary emotion that we should feel. I'm Brett Moore, CEO of Mobile IV Systems. As an Aussie, it breaks my heart to see those images. But my question is there any science or any suggestion that such an event has happened before, mass bleaching of this magnitude anywhere in history, and that we've bounced back? The one thing I'm thinking of is I saw a documentary the other day pointing out that in the Bikini Atoll, where the nuclear test took place, which was devastated, obviously, now has a rich ecosystem. It's a very hopeful question, but I was just wondering if there's any science or any hope that there can be regeneration.
There was a brief section of the movie that actually talked about whether or not these events have happened before. And the work at the Australian Institute of Marine Science has evaluated coral cores, where you can look through the history of the growth of the corals and look for the bands that are evident of past events like this. And from all of their coring work, they don't see any events like this happening in the past. Work that's been done elsewhere around the world really shows that this has been a unique and unfortunately especially damaging event, especially to happen on that sort of scale. And so I wish that we could say that has happened before and that they've bounced back, but it's just really not the case. The good news is, yes, when we've seen things like what's happened at Bikini, and there was major impact, as long as the other conditions were good, the corals were able to bounce back and do well. And that's the reason why hurricanes, cyclones, typhoons, whatever you want to call it, wherever you are, have been damaging to reefs in the past, but they've bounced back. And under normal conditions, that's the case. But with the addition of the bleaching, we're just not seeing the ability of corals to bounce back.
We're going to take one more question, and we're going to open this to all of you. Last question.
Hi there. My name's Charlie Keeks, and I'm one of the FiRe Fellows. We work the staff of the conference, and I'm also a first-year MBA student at the University of Utah and the VP of Awareness for our recently resurrected Net Impact Club. And so my question's really about things that we can do as young leaders that are really actionable. I'm especially interested in issues like policy. Would this be an issue where you would really think at this point we would need radical change rather than incremental change? Are there good persuasion strategies we as kind of young leaders can use with domestic or international leadership? Any advice or thoughts that you've seen really change people's minds or actions or laws?
Well, it really depends on the scale that you're working at, and it's important to work at a variety of scales. One of them is the big scale, trying to make large major changes, and there are a number of groups like Climate Mobilization, 350.org, that are taking this forward from an advocacy perspective and trying to find ways to make those big changes. At the same time, one of the important things happens at a smaller scale. It happens at the individual level. And I've heard from a couple of you so far, talking about how this film was able to grip you emotionally. And that makes a huge difference. People don't take action on issues that they don't feel personally connected to. And so it's that personal involvement, it's getting people engaged and making sure that people understand that we're all looking for the same thing, whether it's a Democrat, whether it's a Republican, conservatives, liberals, progressives. The whole point is there are different approaches for how we can deal with the climate issue, as well as dealing with these other environmental issues. And those are legitimate questions. How do we do that? But we have to come to a common understanding that this is a huge problem. It's impacting many ecosystems and many people around the world already. This isn't some far off distant thing. And so making sure that people understand that this is a problem that we need to be dealing with. And let's have that discussion on how to make those changes.
Yes, a short follow-up question. Would you say scientifically the algae we might see in lake systems, we have a lot of lakes here in Utah, would that also be because of rising temperatures, you think, primarily, or?
That's a combination. There have been issues of nutrients and pollution, but even with the cleanup that has reduced pollution in many of the lakes, the rising temperatures has been throwing things off. We're running into that problem in the Great Lakes right now that has been causing major problems with water supplies in the Great Lake areas. And the same thing could be happening out in your area.
Thanks.
Thank you. And so let's start with Brian. What would you say, what are your ideas as far as what can we do? We want to do something positive, right? We're seeing all the things that are negative. What do you think personally we can, I want all of you guys to answer this. What do you think about the film? How do you see us, any age, trying to change our behavior and change our world and our environment?
Yeah, so the film is fabulous. When you look at it, they did such a good job with this film. They've done it with Chasing Ice also. We could make films called Chasing Snow, Chasing Trees, Chasing Forests. The entire ecosystem of how we see things are going to change. Here in Utah, when we talk about things that are passionate to us, it's centered around powder skiing. And when you look at the place we're at right now, at Stein Erikson, roughly the Wasatch Range that it's located in, during the meteorological winter, December, January, February, we're 100% snow covered. By 2035 to 2065, those same areas are going to be 50% to 25% snow covered and roughly snow void by about 2070, 2080. The winter range will still have snow. It has a higher elevation, probably Big and Little Cottonwood will have some snow at the very tops. But the skiing industry, as we know it, is going to go away. The things we need to do is stop burning fossil fuels, and we need to sequester CO2 in the atmosphere and methane and nitrous oxide. We need to reduce these gases in the atmosphere. CO2 remains in the atmosphere for 1,000 years. What we're doing right now, if we were to stop and get it under control, it's still going to go roughly about 7 degrees Fahrenheit. Our area as business as usual is going to raise about 10 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100. 2 degrees centigrade or 3.8 degrees Fahrenheit is considered the tipping point, meaning once we hit that, we're going to have runaway climate change, basically by feedback loops. An example of a feedback loop is the melting of the permafrost in northern Canada, Alaska, and Siberia, and we're doing this right now. That's releasing large volumes of methane into the atmosphere. The more methane goes in the atmosphere, the more we warm the atmosphere, the more the permafrost melts, and we have this feedback loop, and there's many of these loops that we see. So the idea of just changing light bulbs or feel-good stories are really kind of done. We need to get on this in a big way. I think when you see all of the clean energy initiatives that are being done, Elon Musk sat right up here some years back, I understand, and things like that are really doing it. The next part of this is how are we going to sequester CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide back to levels of about 275 parts per million. That's the range that we've had for roughly 800,000 years, yet we're now at about 408 parts per million, and we're going to double 275 by about 2050 till we're at 550 parts per million. This is a problem. How are we going to sequester this? And if there was ever a group that I address, because I do a lot of this, that could say, you know, we got this. This is the group.
So Brian, we actually have this. We talked about this a little today. It's
Right.
called the S&S carbon trifecta, where we can either do open capture of CO2 or use the coal plants, capture through the flute, use magnesium as a catalyst, and create carbon-based graphene.
This is exactly where we need to go with this,
And that will reverse global warming.
right?
And we're on it.
Good. This is the
Look at carbontrifecta.com. Roger Payne?
I must say it's a very moving film. It just knocked me out. And I think that's what we can take advantage of and use. When somebody, the important thing is to try to stop the use or the buildup of CO2, obviously. And that's going to take something which is a very emotional approach. Well, what we all just saw is a very emotional approach, and it has another advantage, which is it doesn't make any big violations scientifically the way so many such films do. And I would suggest that the effort would be here to get this film shown everywhere you possibly can, to do it with, and I think social media could be used for it, perhaps a club which had members which were in various schools, and you tried to sign up more schools than your friend did, and there would be prizes. They could be very simple for having done so. I don't think you can get it into the school curriculum. Most school curriculums are held under such close control by the political powers that you can't add or subtract much, but you can show these sorts of films at an evening and have people talk about it. And I think the same thing that people tried to do with the film about, you know, the just blocked on the name, the inconvenient truth, could be done better. We've seen what mistakes were made in trying to get that out, but I think the important thing to realize is this isn't just something that would be nice to do and one would feel good about it. Unless we can stop this kind of destruction, we have no future. If the ocean dies, we die. That sounds like, oh, baloney, you know, we live here in Utah, this sea is so far away, how could that possibly be the case? Well, the ocean makes between a third and some people say a half of every breath of oxygen that you take. And I figured out, well, how bad could that be? Suppose you were living in a world that had only 2/3 of the oxygen in it that we're used to breathing with each breath. I mean, after all, here we're up at 8,000 feet, and it seems we're all doing okay. We feel it a bit at night and so on. But I figured out how high you would have to climb to experience a partial pressure of oxygen at the same as would be represented by a third to a half. And it turns out to be nothing to worry about at all. It's only a few hundred meters above the top of Mount Everest. So there is no future without the oceans. And it turns out that, I mean, it's all very well to save whales and try to do that. Yes, that's good, and it's a very emotional approach, which is useful. But if we lose plankton, that's the ball game. We've lost everything. We won't make it. We'll have no future. And I have no interest in living in a world which can be that foolish. My feeling is, okay, I'm out of here. I do feel that people have to realize there is nothing that any of us do that is nearly as important as we could achieve by taking a film like this and trying to get it into, let's say, 10,000 schools by the end of the summer of next year, something like that. I think it's a useful film because of the fact that it's so well made and has such a solidly good and excellent message.
FiRe feature films, FiReFilms itself, actually, we have screening clubs all over the world. We have educational outreach, and this is why FiReFilms exists. We want to be able to get films like this out to the most important people, young and old, so that we know what we can do about our situation and get together and do something about it. In Racing Extinction, we showed that last year with Luis Arroyos. And Racing Extinction, Louis came back with one major thing. He said, you know, if anybody were to do one thing to try to stop global warming, it would be to stop eating meat because of the methane produced by the cows. So now he's working on a whole vegan film right now to try to save the planet from methane.
I live right next door to Paul Watson, and I will try to get him to get Sea Shepherd to show this film absolutely everywhere. Won't be hard, I think. And they have a huge coverage. Of course, Jane Goodall has a wonderful collection of people. I'll contact her too. But I think anyone who knows anybody who, no matter how distant, might be interested in showing it, I think it should happen.
This is perfect. We have corporate sponsorships and memberships. Please join. It's not much. And we'll show this corporately. We'll Skype anybody in that we can. Love to have you back with us. Let's make this happen. Corporations have people that really care within them. So, okay, Brian.
One thing, if I may just add very quickly, is that Roger was talking about getting this into schools and so forth, and the difficulty of that. There are versions. While the full version is spectacular, and I don't know what they would cut out to do this. They are going to be producing shorter versions, as they did with Chasing Ice, specifically for the educational audience. You can fit it within an hour's time period and things of that sort.
Netflix will. Is that Netflix?
The Exposure Labs team that put together Chasing Corals, they'll be releasing an educational disc version in the not too distant future.
We will share that within Utah.
Great.
Well, first I want to respond to a question raised a few minutes ago about what other kinds of human impacts might be affecting coral. One of the things that we know is affecting the health of coral is the chemical stew that's created by human sunscreen. So divers that are in the ocean, unfortunately, there is some real chemical toxicity to things as simple as sunscreen that is having a profound effect on marine life, especially coral. To kind of move on to a broader brush, I think we need to understand and try and preach this in every sort of family discussion, every sort of educational opportunity, every sort of community interaction, that the reason why the climate crisis is a crisis is because it's a human crisis. It's a human survival crisis. That point has been mentioned already, but let me amplify that a little bit. The medical community has been slow to get on board with what this really represents in terms of a threat to public health. But finally, in the last 7 to 8 years, the major medical organizations of the entire world, including the United States, including the very conservative or historically conservative American Medical Association, has declared the climate crisis the greatest public health threat of the 21st century. And maybe even that understates the issue. But I think the contribution that we can make is to help people understand that the climate crisis not only threatens their own personal health, sometimes acutely with extreme weather events, and in other ways chronically, with higher temperatures, more air pollution. The kinds of air pollution that we know are having a profound effect on human health are all augmented by warmer temperatures. If you take ozone, the high volume pollutants, ozone and particulate matter, ozone is a chemical created or catalyzed by warmer temperatures in the atmosphere. So we're going to have higher and higher ozone concentrations to deal with. Particulate matter, you're seeing right now these massive wildfires in California. You've seen throughout the summer massive wildfires in British Columbia. In Utah, we've actually had a reasonably benign wildfire season, but it's not always that way, and it won't be in the future. Well, that creates intense concentrations of particulate matter, and that has both of those have profound effects on human health. All the fracking ponds that are now adjacent to the tens of thousands of fracking wells throughout the country, the VOCs that are evaporated from those fracking ponds are very toxic chemicals that, as the temperature is increased, those temperatures tend to those chemicals volatilize even further. So we know that for a variety of reasons, the climate crisis is a human crisis. More specifically, it's a human health crisis. And let me amplify the point that you just made very briefly. We don't talk anywhere near enough about how our diet affects the climate. And in fact, the issue of fossil fuels' contribution to the climate crisis is a tough problem. It's embedded almost inextricably with our lifestyle. So I understand how people aren't necessarily all that excited to ride their bikes to work when they've got a car and they can do it quickly and they can do it conveniently with very little effort on their part. I get that. But changing a person's diet is perhaps the easiest way that people can contribute meaningfully to individual solutions. And I know this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but it's been described that if you ride your bike to work, I do, to the hospital and back, you may be doing more damage to the climate by eating a hamburger for lunch once you get there than the benefit you're giving to the community by riding your bike instead of taking your car. So it is a big deal, and on a broader scale, our diet, especially our meat-intensive diet, probably contributes about 18% of the whole greenhouse gas phenomenon, which is almost as much as all of our transportation infrastructure. So it's a huge deal. From a personal health standpoint, we would all be much better off, much healthier, if we ate an awful lot less meat. So we ought to be able to give that kind of information to the public and say, none of this is easy, but there are some simple things that everybody can do. We'll all benefit, the climate will benefit, we'll stabilize our future.
Thank you. And I think, do you have something to say, Roger?
Yeah, I wanted to add one thing. We keep talking about the great problems of climate change, and that is the great problem and so on. I'll just to be provocative, I'll say I don't think it's as big a problem as the problem of ocean acidification. And my reason for saying that is that the problems of ocean acidification progressed to their really catastrophic and terrible state in decades, whereas climate change requires more nearly centuries to get to its absolute worst effects. Of course, they're caused by the same thing, the CO2 in the water. So everything that we've been talking about so far in coral reefs is made vastly worse by the fact that as the pH of the oceans gets more and more acidic, it becomes impossible for coral, may at some point become impossible for coral to even make reefs anymore, regardless of whether we could imagine the oceans getting cooler. So I think it's, anyway, I think it's a point that we need to realize that it's such a serious situation that every single one of us should be devoting some large percentage of their lives to doing something about it.
I think, from my perspective, this is my first time at this conference. And truly, I was blown away at how awesome this is. Wonderful science and technology all day. But in the back of my mind, I just could not get it out of my head that it's all going to be folly if we don't get climate change under control. Because we're going to have so many problems and so many issues that we can't even perceive right now, that all this cool science and technology that we've talked about today, which is wonderful, will seem to be in the background as we're kind of fighting for our survival of our grandchildren and their grandchildren and so on. And it's a lot faster than we think when we look at the business as usual projections of how much it's going to warm and how much the storms are going to change and become more intense. Droughts are going to become worse. There is just a long list of things that are going to really have a hard time with. And, for you and I, it won't be as bad. But for the people in the audience, the young lady who we heard earlier who's 20-something, she's going to have a lot harder time. And her children are going to have a much worse time than she did. And it's just going to go down to generations. We need to get a handle on this. We need to get smart about this. And we need to get on this fast.
There's a film, the second FiRe featured film we showed after the Cove was Climate Refugees. And I don't know if any of you have seen those, but that was for our FiRe attendees. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. They couldn't believe the storms that were going to be hitting Miami, or that, or Louisiana, or New Orleans was going to be underwater, or that parts of New York are going to be underwater. They thought the whole thing was crazy. And the director said, this isn't crazy, this is planning. We need to be educated so that we can plan, because we need to adapt. While we're making our own individual changes, we need to educate ourselves and others, plan, and make the adaptations that we have to make.
Individual lifestyle adaptations are obviously critical, but there's a limit to how much they can do. Everybody here has to become engaged in the political process. We've just seen a catastrophic election almost a year ago, and we're seeing what the consequences are unfolding almost by the day, including yesterday the EPA announced the abandonment of the Clean Power Plan. So everybody that's here and is moved by this film and concerned about the implications for our future, there is no future without us becoming engaged in the political process. And let me also add that when we think about what are our avenues for change on a macro scale, the political process for sure, but tied to that is a media that is much more responsible than they currently behave. All of you have probably heard everything about Kim Kardashian's life from the media 1,000 times more than the climate crisis. And I think somebody actually tried to calculate how much media attention was given to Kim Kardashian compared to the end of civilization. And it's like a ratio of about 100 to 1. So the public has to put pressure on media outlets to actually cover issues of substance, of meaning, that actually determine our future. And right now they just aren't.
This is one of the things that Roger raised, the issue of ocean acidification, which is a very important one. And I won't get into the debates of which is going to be worse, because it really depends on what part of the system you're looking at. From the perspective of coral reefs, I used to be very concerned about ocean acidification. I'm far less concerned than I used to be. And the only reason is because this bleaching is becoming so severe, so much quicker than we thought it was, that it doesn't matter how quickly a coral can grow if it's dead. So, we're looking at a situation that is really one where we're seeing changes coming on very quickly. The whole idea of the 50 Reefs program, the reason for the 50 reefs is we're looking to lose probably 90% of the world's coral reefs by the middle part of this century. And that's a very sobering statistic. And it's consistent across all of the work that's been done with climate modeling. And when we think about that, by mid-century, what's going to happen in the climate system at mid-century are has already been determined by actions we've been taking now. The actions we're taking in the next 5, 10, 20 years is what's going to define what occurs in the rest of the century. So whether it's the ocean acidification, whether it's the warming, whether it's the many other parts of the system that are being broken down by the excess CO2 that's already in the atmosphere, this is something we've got to be working on much faster than we are now. And so all three of you are absolutely right. I mean, this is something of absolute paramount importance right now.
Mark, thank you so much for joining us. And all of our panels, you were amazing. Michael, thank you so much for explaining to all of us what we didn't know and for inspiring us to do something about it. And join FiReFilms. Please follow us, hashtag futurereview.com. Let's make a difference. Corporations, please join us. Let's be able to show these films to corporations, to people all over the world, and through educational outreach. Thank you all for joining us tonight.